an empire that ruled for over 6 centuries, stretching from the windswept peaks of the Alps to the rolling plains of Hungary, from the Baroque palaces of Vienna to the sun-drenched shores of the Adriatic. An empire so vast, so enduring, that it seemed as eternal as the mountains themselves. The Habsburg Dynasty, a name that once commanded respect across Europe, whose double-headed eagle soared over territories where dozens of languages were spoken and countless cultures flourished under one imperial crown. But empires, like the mortals who build them, are not immortal. And the Habsburg Empire, for all its grandeur and longevity, was destined to crumble not through a single catastrophic blow, but through the accumulated weight of decisions made by 10 crucial figures, some wearing crowns, others wielding pens, and still others carrying the burden of ideological revolution. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the twilight years of one of history's greatest dynasties. We'll walk through the marble corridors of Schönbrunn Palace, witness the fateful moments in Sarajevo, and stand in the shadow of world-changing decisions that would reshape the map of Europe forever. This is not just a story of political maneuvering or military defeat. This is the story of how personal choices, ideological movements, and the relentless march of history converged to bring down a dynasty that had weathered the storms of centuries. Our tale begins in the opulent but increasingly fragile world of late 19th century Austria-Hungary, where an aging emperor sat on a throne that was already beginning to crack under the weight of nationalism, modernization, and the approaching thunderclouds of global warfare. Franz Joseph I, the eternal emperor's fatal miscalculations. In the gilded halls of the Hofburg Palace, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on portraits of Habsburg ancestors, there ruled a man who seemed as permanent as the very stones of Vienna itself. Franz Joseph I, Emperor of Austria and Apostolic King of Hungary, had occupied his throne for so long that his subjects could scarcely imagine a world without him. For 68 years, from 1848 to 1916, he presided over the dual monarchy with the mechanical precision of a clockwork emperor, maintaining the delicate balance of his multi-ethnic empire through routine, tradition, and an almost supernatural capacity for administrative detail. Born in 1830, Franz Joseph ascended to power during the revolutionary upheavals that swept across Europe like wildfire. At just 18 years old, he inherited an empire in crisis, with Hungarian revolutionaries declaring independence, Italian states rebelling against Austrian rule, and the very foundations of Habsburg authority shaking beneath his feet. Yet through sheer persistence, conservative wisdom, and perhaps a touch of Habsburg stubbornness, he managed to restore order and maintain his vast domain for nearly 7 decades. But therein lay both his greatest strength and his ultimate weakness. Franz Joseph was a man of the 19th century attempting to govern a 20th century world. He rose each morning at 4 o'clock, read every document that crossed his desk, and maintained a personal audience schedule that would exhaust men half his age. His devotion to duty was legendary, his attention to detail obsessive, and his commitment to the Habsburg ideal of multi-ethnic unity genuine. Yet this same devotion to tradition would prove catastrophic when the world around him began to change at an unprecedented pace. The emperor's personal life read like a Greek tragedy written by fate itself. His brother Maximilian, whom he had sent to rule Mexico, was executed by firing squad in 1867. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in mysterious circumstances at Mayerling in 1889, leaving behind conspiracy theories that persist to this day. His beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, was assassinated by an anarchist stiletto in Geneva in 1898, and his nephew and heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would meet his fate in Sarajevo in 1914, lighting the fuse that would ignite World War I. Each personal tragedy seemed to harden Franz Joseph's resolve to maintain the old order, to preserve the empire that had cost his family so much blood and sorrow. He became increasingly isolated, increasingly rigid, increasingly unable to adapt to the forces of nationalism that were tearing his empire apart from within. The Czechs demanded autonomy, the South Slavs looked toward Serbia for inspiration, the Italians dreamed of unification with their brothers to the south, and even the Hungarians, despite their privileged position in the dual monarchy, chafed under Viennese control. Franz Joseph's response to these growing tensions was always the same: more administration, more bureaucracy, more attempts to balance competing interests through imperial decree. He spoke 8 languages fluently and could converse with his subjects in their native tongues, yet he seemed incapable of understanding the deeper currents of national consciousness that were reshaping European identity. He was like a master conductor attempting to lead an orchestra whose musicians were increasingly playing different symphonies. The emperor's military background, he had served as a young officer and maintained a lifelong fascination with uniforms, parades, and martial ceremony, would prove particularly disastrous when the crisis of 1914 arrived. Despite being 84 years old and having ruled through multiple conflicts, Franz Joseph still thought in terms of 19th-century warfare: quick campaigns, limited objectives, and negotiated settlements. The concept of total war, of entire nations mobilizing their industrial capacity for prolonged conflict, was foreign to his experience and his worldview. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, Franz Joseph faced the greatest crisis of his long reign. The heir to his throne, a man he had often disagreed with but had come to rely upon, was dead at the hands of Serbian-backed conspirators. The honor of the Habsburg Dynasty demanded satisfaction, and his military advisors assured him that a swift punitive expedition against Serbia would restore Austrian prestige and deter future challenges to imperial authority. But Franz Joseph had grown old in a world that no longer existed. The intricate system of alliances that had maintained European balance for decades had transformed into a powder keg waiting for a spark. His declaration of war against Serbia on July 28, 1814, activated a chain reaction that would drag Russia, Germany, France, and eventually Britain into the largest conflict the world had ever seen. The emperor's decision-making during the July crisis revealed the fundamental weakness of his rule: an inability to distinguish between what was possible in 1850 and what was possible in 1914. He authorized the famous blank check that gave Germany carte blanche to support Austrian actions, not understanding that he was essentially surrendering control of Habsburg foreign policy to Berlin. He believed that Russian Tsar Nicholas II, his fellow monarch and distant relative, would ultimately back down to preserve the principle of dynastic solidarity, not comprehending that nationalism had become more powerful than royal blood ties. When the war began, Franz Joseph threw himself into the conflict with the energy of a man half his age, reviewing troop deployments, studying maps, and maintaining correspondence with his field commanders. He genuinely believed that Austrian forces, backed by German military might, would achieve a quick victory that would strengthen the empire and silence its critics. Instead, he found himself presiding over a military disaster that exposed every weakness in the Habsburg system. The Austrian army, despite its colorful uniforms and proud traditions, was poorly equipped, inadequately led, and fatally divided by the same ethnic tensions that plagued the empire as a whole. Czech regiments surrendered en masse to the Russians. Italian units showed little enthusiasm for fighting their ethnic cousins, and even Hungarian formations proved unreliable when their homeland was threatened. The dual monarchy that Franz Joseph had spent decades trying to balance proved incapable of waging effective war against enemies who fought with the unity of national purpose. As casualties mounted and military defeats multiplied, the emperor's health began to fail. The man who had seemed immortal, who had survived revolution, assassination attempts, and personal tragedies that would have broken lesser mortals, finally began to show his age. He continued to work at his desk, continued to receive reports from the front, continued to sign the orders that sent more of his subjects to their deaths. But those who saw him in his final months reported a monarch who seemed to be fading before their eyes. Franz Joseph died on November 21, 1916, in the same bed where he had slept for decades, surrounded by the same ritual and ceremony that had defined his reign. He passed away believing that the war could still be won, that the empire could still be preserved, that the old order could still triumph over the forces of change. He never lived to see the complete collapse of everything he had spent his life defending. The emperor's death marked more than the end of a life. It marked the end of an era. For 68 years, Franz Joseph had embodied the Habsburg ideal of unity through diversity, of empire through balance, of stability through tradition. His death removed the last figure who commanded genuine loyalty across the empire's many ethnic groups, the last symbol of continuity with the glorious Habsburg past. Without him, the empire became merely a political arrangement rather than a living embodiment of dynastic legitimacy. Franz Joseph's legacy is complex and tragic. He was undoubtedly a man of integrity, devoted to his duty and genuinely concerned for the welfare of his subjects. His empire, despite its flaws, provided a framework for peaceful coexistence among ethnic groups that would spend the next century in bloody conflict. Yet his inability to adapt to changing times, his rigid adherence to outdated methods, and his fateful decision to go to war in 1914 made him the unwitting architect of his dynasty's destruction. The emperor who had seemed eternal proved to be profoundly mortal, and his death would usher in the final act of the Habsburg drama. Karl I, the last emperor's desperate gamble. When Archduke Karl Franz Joseph became Emperor Karl I of Austria and Charles IV of Hungary on November 21, 1916, he inherited more than a crown, he inherited a catastrophe. At just 29 years old, this reluctant emperor found himself ruling over an empire that was literally bleeding to death on multiple fronts, its treasury empty, its armies in retreat, and its subject peoples increasingly convinced that their future lay not with the Habsburgs but with the new nation-states that were emerging from the wreckage of the old European order. Karl had never been intended for the throne. Born in 1887, he was the grandnephew of Franz Joseph, third in line of succession, expected to live the comfortable life of a minor archduke serving in the military and attending court functions. His path to power was paved with tragedy. First the suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf in 1889, then the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. By the time Karl became emperor, the Habsburg dynasty was running out of heirs just as it was running out of time. Unlike his great-uncle, Karl was a man of the 20th century. He understood that the old world was dying and that survival required radical adaptation. He spoke of social reform, democratization, and a more federal structure that would give the empire's many nationalities greater autonomy within a Habsburg framework. He envisioned an Austria-Hungary that could evolve with the times rather than resist them, that could harness the energy of nationalism rather than be destroyed by it. But Karl's greatest asset, his youth and flexibility, was also his greatest weakness. He lacked the authority that comes with decades of rule, the network of relationships that Franz Joseph had built over 68 years on the throne, and the respect that even opponents had grudgingly accorded the old emperor. To many of his subjects, Karl was an untested boy trying to fill the shoes of a giant, a newcomer attempting to solve problems that had defeated far more experienced rulers. The new emperor's first challenge was the war itself. By late 1916, Austria-Hungary was barely functioning as a military power. The Brusilov offensive had decimated Austrian forces on the Eastern Front, Italian attacks were grinding down Habsburg positions in the Alps, and the economic strain of total war was causing social unrest throughout the empire. Karl inherited military commanders who had lost confidence in victory, civilian officials who were barely maintaining basic government services, and a population that was beginning to starve. Karl's response revealed both his intelligence and his tragic position. Unlike Franz Joseph, who had viewed the war in terms of dynastic honor and territorial integrity, Karl understood that the conflict had become an existential threat to the Habsburg Empire itself. He began secret peace negotiations with the Western Allies, attempting to secure a separate peace that would preserve his empire even at the cost of abandoning Germany, Austria-Hungary's primary ally. These peace feelers, conducted through his brother-in-law Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, represented a desperate but rational strategy. Karl was willing to make enormous concessions: autonomy for the empire's Slavic populations, territorial adjustments in favor of Italy, even the restoration of Alsace-Lorraine to France. He understood that the old Austria-Hungary was dead and was willing to accept a much reduced but still viable Habsburg state that could survive in the new Europe that was taking shape. But Karl's peace initiatives, known to history as the Sixtus Affair, ultimately backfired spectacularly. When details of the negotiations leaked in 1918, they destroyed Austria-Hungary's relationship with Germany without achieving peace with the Allies. The German leadership, already suspicious of Habsburg reliability, now viewed Karl as a traitor who had attempted to betray their alliance. The Allies, meanwhile, had by 1918 committed themselves to the complete dismantlement of Austria-Hungary in favor of independent nation-states, making Karl's offers of federal reform irrelevant. The young emperor found himself trapped between German anger and Allied indifference, commanding an army that was disintegrating and ruling an empire whose subject peoples were openly declaring independence. Czech and Slovak leaders proclaimed the independence of Czechoslovakia, South Slavs announced the creation of Yugoslavia, and even the Hungarians began to distance themselves from Vienna. The multi-ethnic empire that the Habsburgs had ruled for centuries was simply dissolving, like a sugar cube dropped in water. Karl's domestic reforms, well-intentioned though they were, came too late to save the situation. His attempts to democratize the empire, to grant equal rights to all nationalities, and to establish a more federal system were overtaken by events. Why accept autonomy within a Habsburg framework when complete independence was now possible? Why reform the old empire when new nation-states promised a fresh start free from centuries of imperial control? The emperor's personal character made his situation even more poignant. Unlike many of his Habsburg predecessors, Karl was a devoted family man, deeply religious, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of his subjects. He lived modestly by imperial standards, refused to engage in the elaborate court ceremonies that had characterized Franz Joseph's reign, and demonstrated real compassion for the suffering caused by the war. In different circumstances, he might have been remembered as one of the great reforming monarchs of European history. But Karl was attempting to reform an empire that was already dead, to democratize institutions that had lost all legitimacy, to modernize a system that his subjects were abandoning en masse. He was like a ship's captain trying to repair a vessel that was already beneath the waves, a conductor attempting to lead an orchestra whose musicians had already left the stage. The end came with shocking speed. On October 16, 1918, Karl issued a manifesto promising to transform Austria-Hungary into a federal state where each nationality would form its own autonomous government. This desperate attempt to preserve Habsburg rule through radical decentralization was ignored by the empire's subject peoples, who were already establishing independent governments. The manifesto that was meant to save the empire merely provided official acknowledgement that the old centralized Austria-Hungary was dead. As military collapse accelerated and revolutionary movements spread throughout the empire, Karl found himself isolated in Schönbrunn Palace, an emperor without an empire, a king whose subjects had simply walked away. On November 11, 1918, the same day that the armistice ended World War I, Karl signed a proclamation acknowledging the right of the Austrian people to determine their own future and withdrawing from participation in state affairs. Crucially, he did not formally abdicate, maintaining that he was merely stepping aside temporarily until the crisis passed. This refusal to formally abdicate would define the rest of Karl's life. Unlike other monarchs who accepted the end of their reigns with resignation, Karl never stopped believing that he could restore Habsburg rule. He spent the remaining years of his life in exile, first in Switzerland and then on the Portuguese island of Madeira, plotting returns to power and maintaining correspondence with Habsburg loyalists who shared his belief that the monarchy could be restored. Karl's two attempts to regain the Hungarian throne in 1921 revealed both his determination and his tragic misunderstanding of the new European reality. He genuinely believed that the chaos and instability that followed the empire's collapse would convince his former subjects to welcome a Habsburg restoration. Instead, his return attempts were met with indifference or hostility, as people who had moved on to new forms of government saw him as a relic of a discredited past. The last Habsburg emperor died of pneumonia on Madeira in 1922, at just 34 years old, still believing that his empire would someday be restored. His final words were reportedly about his duty to his peoples and his hope that they would someday understand that the old empire had offered something valuable that the new nation-states could not replace. He was buried in a simple ceremony, far from the imperial crypts of Vienna where his ancestors lay in state. Karl's tragedy was not personal failure but historical timing. He was an intelligent, well-meaning ruler who understood the need for change and was willing to make radical reforms to preserve his empire. But he came to power too late, when the forces he was trying to harness had already moved beyond the possibility of imperial accommodation. The nationalism that might have been channeled into federal autonomy in 1867 or even 1897 had by 1918 become a demand for complete independence that no Habsburg concession could satisfy. In many ways, Karl represented the road not taken, the possibility of evolutionary change that might have preserved the Habsburg Empire in some form while accommodating the legitimate aspirations of its many peoples. His failure marked not just the end of his personal reign, but the end of the very idea that multi-ethnic empires could survive in an age of national self-determination. The crown that Karl inherited was already cracking when it was placed on his head, and despite his best efforts, he could not prevent it from finally shattering completely. His reign marked the end of over 6 centuries of Habsburg rule and the beginning of a new chapter in European history, one written in the language of nationalism rather than dynastic loyalty, one that would prove far bloodier than the old imperial order it replaced. Woodrow Wilson, the idealist who dismantled empires. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the white-columned halls of Washington, D.C., sat a man whose pen would prove mightier than any Habsburg sword, whose words would reshape the map of Europe more decisively than any military campaign. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, was an unlikely destroyer of dynasties, a former academic with wire-rimmed spectacles and a professorial manner who spoke in measured tones about democracy, self-determination, and the destiny of nations. Wilson was not born to power in the traditional sense. The son of a Presbyterian minister from Virginia, he had spent most of his adult life in the quiet halls of academia, serving as a professor and eventually president of Princeton University. His world was one of lecture halls and scholarly debates, of constitutional theory and progressive reform. Yet it was precisely this background, this combination of idealistic vision and intellectual rigor, that would make him such a formidable opponent of the old European order. When Wilson entered the White House in 1913, the Habsburg Empire was still viewed as one of the permanent fixtures of European politics. Few Americans could even locate Austria-Hungary on a map, and fewer still understood the complex ethnic and linguistic divisions that made the dual monarchy such a delicate balancing act. Wilson himself initially showed little interest in Central European affairs, focusing instead on domestic reform and his complicated relationship with revolutionary Mexico. But the Great War changed everything. As Europe tore itself apart in the trenches of France and the mountains of Austria-Hungary, Wilson found himself increasingly drawn into the conflict, not as a traditional balance of power politician but as a moral crusader convinced that this war represented a fundamental choice between democracy and autocracy, between the will of the people and the privilege of dynasties. Wilson's transformation from neutral observer to active participant in European affairs began with his growing conviction that the war represented something more than a mere territorial dispute between rival empires. In his mind, the conflict became a struggle between two incompatible visions of human organization: the old world of hereditary monarchy, ethnic hierarchy, and imperial domination, and a new world of democratic self-governance, national self-determination, and international cooperation. The president's intellectual journey toward becoming the Habsburg Empire's unwitting executioner can be traced through his speeches and writings during the neutrality period from 1914 to 1917. Initially, Wilson saw the war as a tragic example of old-world politics that America should avoid. But as German submarine warfare threatened American lives and commerce, and as reports of battlefield casualties reached astronomical proportions, Wilson began to articulate a vision of American involvement that went far beyond mere military assistance to the Allies. In his mind, America's entry into the war would not be about helping Britain and France defeat Germany and Austria-Hungary in a traditional balance of power conflict. Instead, American participation would transform the entire nature of the struggle, turning it into a war to end all wars, a conflict that would establish new principles of international relations based on democratic values and national self-determination rather than dynastic claims and imperial ambition. Wilson's famous 14 points, announced to Congress on January 8, 1918, represented nothing less than a complete repudiation of the principles on which the Habsburg Empire was founded. Where the Habsburgs had built their power on the idea that diverse ethnic groups could be united under a single imperial crown, Wilson proclaimed that national aspirations must be respected, and that peoples must be dominated and governed only by their own consent. The 10th point specifically addressed Austria-Hungary, calling for the freest opportunity of autonomous development for the peoples of the empire. While this language seemed to suggest that Wilson might accept a federalized Habsburg state, the underlying logic of his position made such accommodation impossible. If peoples had the right to self-determination, and if legitimate government required the consent of the governed, then what moral authority could any emperor claim over subjects who wished to govern themselves? Wilson's intellectual framework made him particularly dangerous to the Habsburg cause because his opposition was not based on traditional power politics but on moral principle. Previous American presidents might have been willing to accept Austrian territorial adjustments or constitutional reforms as part of a negotiated peace settlement. But Wilson was not interested in merely rearranging the furniture of European politics. He wanted to demolish the entire house and build something completely new. The president's academic background proved crucial in this regard. As a political scientist, Wilson understood that the Habsburg Empire represented a pre-modern form of political organization that was fundamentally incompatible with democratic principles. As a historian, he knew that empires based on dynastic legitimacy rather than popular consent were artifacts of an earlier age that could not survive in a world where ordinary people expected to have a voice in their own governance. Wilson's correspondence during 1918 reveals a man who had become genuinely convinced that the Habsburg Empire was not merely politically inconvenient but morally illegitimate. In his view, Franz Joseph and Karl I were not merely enemy rulers but representatives of an outdated system that denied basic human rights to millions of people. The empire's very existence was an affront to the principles of democracy and self-determination that Wilson believed represented the future of human civilization. This moral conviction gave Wilson enormous influence over American policy toward Central Europe, but it also made him remarkably inflexible when it came to potential compromise solutions. When Emperor Karl I made his secret peace overtures through the Sixtus Affair, Wilson showed little interest in negotiations that might preserve the Habsburg Empire in any form. Similarly, when various Austrian politicians proposed federal reforms or autonomous arrangements that might satisfy ethnic minorities while maintaining the imperial framework, Wilson remained convinced that anything short of complete dissolution was inadequate. The president's position was strengthened by his relationships with Central European émigré leaders who had fled to America and other Allied countries during the war. Figures like Tomáš Masaryk, the future president of Czechoslovakia, and Ignacy Paderewski, the future premier of Poland, had direct access to Wilson and his advisors, allowing them to present their case for independent nation-states in terms that resonated with American democratic ideals. These émigré leaders were skilled at translating their nationalist aspirations into the language of Wilsonian idealism. They did not present themselves as ethnic separatists seeking to break up a functioning state, but as democratic patriots fighting for the basic right of self-governance that Americans had claimed in their own Declaration of Independence. They portrayed the Habsburg Empire not as a multinational state trying to balance competing interests, but as a prison house of nations that denied fundamental human rights to its subject peoples. Wilson found these arguments compelling because they fit perfectly with his understanding of American history and democratic theory. Just as the American colonists had been justified in breaking away from British imperial rule, so the Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, and South Slavs were justified in seeking independence from Habsburg imperial rule. The principle was the same. No people should be governed without their consent, regardless of the historical claims or administrative convenience of their rulers. As the war progressed and Austrian military resistance began to collapse, Wilson's position became increasingly radical. By the summer of 1918, he had moved beyond calling for autonomous development within the Habsburg framework to endorsing complete independence for the empire's subject nationalities. His public statements began referring to Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia as if they were already established states rather than political movements seeking international recognition. This shift in American policy had enormous practical consequences. When the Habsburg government attempted to negotiate an armistice in October 1918, they found that Wilson was no longer willing to deal with imperial representatives. Instead, he insisted on negotiating directly with the leaders of the emerging nation-states, effectively recognizing their independence before the war had even officially ended. Wilson's refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Habsburg government in its final weeks removed the empire's last hope for a negotiated survival. Previous peace settlements in European history had typically involved territorial adjustments and constitutional reforms while preserving the basic structure of existing states. But Wilson's insistence on dealing only with nationalist leaders meant that the Habsburg Empire could not even participate in determining its own fate. The president's ideological commitment to self-determination also made it impossible for him to consider the practical problems that would arise from the empire's dissolution. Wilson seemed to assume that once the subject nationalities achieved independence, they would naturally organize themselves into stable, democratic states that would cooperate peacefully with their neighbors. He showed little awareness of the ethnic minorities within ethnic minorities, the disputed territories, and the economic interdependencies that had developed over centuries of imperial rule. Wilson's vision of post-war Central Europe was essentially a projection of American democratic ideals onto a region with completely different historical experiences and political traditions. He imagined that Czech farmers and Slovak peasants would embrace democratic institutions with the same enthusiasm as American immigrants seeking citizenship. He assumed that the new nation-states would resolve their disputes through peaceful negotiation rather than force, just as American states had mostly learned to do within the federal system. This idealistic naivety would have tragic consequences in the decades that followed the Habsburg collapse. The nation-states that emerged from the empire's ruins would prove far less stable and democratic than Wilson had anticipated. Ethnic conflicts that had been managed, however imperfectly, within the imperial framework would erupt into open warfare. Economic systems that had been integrated across imperial boundaries would fragment, creating poverty and instability. But these future problems were invisible to Wilson in 1918, as he basked in the apparent triumph of democratic ideals over dynastic privilege. From his perspective, the dissolution of Austria-Hungary represented a great victory for human freedom, a vindication of the principles that had guided American development since the founding of the Republic. He genuinely believed that he was helping to create a better world, one where ordinary people would have greater control over their own destinies. Wilson's role in the Habsburg collapse was thus both intentional and accidental. He deliberately set out to undermine the legitimacy of dynastic rule and imperial organization, believing that these represented outdated forms of political control that had no place in the modern world. But he did not fully understand the specific mechanisms by which his principles would destroy the Austria-Hungary, nor did he anticipate the chaos and conflict that would follow the empire's dissolution. In the end, Woodrow Wilson succeeded in his goal of making the world safe for democracy, at least in the narrow sense of eliminating one of Europe's last great multinational empires. But the world he helped create would prove far more dangerous and unstable than the one he had destroyed, a lesson that would echo through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Theodor Herzl, the visionary who fractured unity. In the elegant coffeehouses of fin de siècle Vienna, where intellectuals gathered to debate the future of European civilization over cups of strong Turkish coffee and slices of Zahortorta, few conversations were more intense than those surrounding what was delicately called the Jewish question. And at the center of these discussions, both literally and figuratively, sat a man whose vision would ultimately contribute to the unraveling of the very empire that had given him birth, education, and early success. Theodor Herzl was, in many ways, the perfect product of Habsburg multiculturalism. Born in 1860 in Budapest to a prosperous German-speaking Jewish family, educated in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Vienna, fluent in multiple languages and comfortable in diverse social settings, he embodied the empire's ideal of unity through diversity. Yet it was precisely this experience of Habsburg pluralism that would lead him to conclude that such unity was ultimately impossible, that Jews could never be truly secure as a minority within Gentile societies, no matter how tolerant those societies might appear. Herzl's journey from Habsburg patriot to Zionist revolutionary began not with persecution but with observation. As a young journalist covering the Dreyfus Affair in Paris during the 1890s, he witnessed firsthand how quickly the veneer of European tolerance could crack, how rapidly Jewish citizens could be transformed from respected members of society into scapegoats for national frustrations. The sight of Parisian crowds shouting "Death to the Jews" outside the courtroom where Captain Alfred Dreyfus was being tried for treason convinced Herzl that antisemitism was not merely a remnant of medieval superstition but a fundamental feature of European political life. But Herzl's revelation went deeper than simple recognition of anti-Semitic sentiment. What truly alarmed him was the realization that assimilation, the strategy that his own family and thousands of other Habsburg Jews had pursued, was not merely insufficient but actively dangerous. The more successfully Jews integrated into Gentile society, the more they became targets of suspicion and resentment. Dreyfus himself was the perfect example. A patriotic French officer, fully assimilated into French culture, yet destroyed by the very society he had sought to serve. This insight had profound implications for the Habsburg Empire, where Jewish integration had proceeded further and more successfully than perhaps anywhere else in Europe. The dual monarchy's complex ethnic structure had created numerous opportunities for Jewish advancement in business, the professions, and even government service. Jews served as a kind of neutral element between competing nationalisms, often playing crucial roles as administrators, merchants, and intellectuals who could bridge linguistic and cultural divides. Herzl himself had benefited enormously from this system. His legal training, his career as a playwright and journalist, his social connections in Viennese society, all of this would have been impossible in most other European countries of his era. Yet his analysis of the Dreyfus affair led him to conclude that this apparent success was built on fundamentally unstable foundations, that the tolerance of the Habsburg system could not be relied upon to protect Jewish interests indefinitely. The publication of Herzl's pamphlet Der Judenstaat, The Jewish State, in 1896, represented a direct challenge to the Habsburg model of ethnic accommodation, where the empire sought to manage competing nationalisms through careful balancing and administrative compromise. Herzl argued that such arrangements were inherently temporary, and that each people ultimately required its own sovereign territory to achieve security and dignity. Herzl's argument was particularly subversive because it applied to the Habsburg Empire the same logic that was already being used by Czech, Polish, and other nationalist movements. If Czechs deserved their own state because they constituted a distinct nation with their own language, culture, and historical experiences, then why shouldn't Jews, who also possess these characteristics, have the same right? If the empire's various Slavic populations were justified in seeking independence or autonomy, then what moral authority could Vienna claim over any of its ethnic minorities? The Zionist movement that Herzl founded and led thus represented more than simply another nationalist challenge to Habsburg authority. It represented a fundamental critique of the empire's basic organizing principle, the idea that diverse ethnic groups could coexist peacefully under imperial rule. By arguing that Jews needed their own state to achieve security and self-determination, Herzl was implicitly arguing that the Habsburg solution to ethnic diversity was inadequate for any group that took its national identity seriously. This critique was particularly dangerous because it came from within the system itself. Herzl was not an external enemy of the Habsburg Empire but a product of its culture, educated in its universities, fluent in its languages, familiar with its institutions. His argument against imperial accommodation could not be dismissed as foreign propaganda or cultural misunderstanding. It represented an insider's assessment that the system was fundamentally flawed. Herzl's personal trajectory also embodied a larger pattern that would prove devastating to Habsburg stability. Like many Habsburg Jews, he had initially embraced German culture and liberal politics, viewing himself as part of the empire's German-speaking elite rather than as a member of a separate Jewish nation. But his gradual realization that this assimilationist strategy was ultimately futile led him to embrace a more radical alternative that explicitly rejected the possibility of minority integration within multinational states. The psychological impact of this transformation extended far beyond the Jewish community. If successful, educated, patriotic citizens like Herzl could conclude that the Habsburg system offered them no long-term security, what did this say about the empire's ability to maintain the loyalty of other ethnic minorities? If Jews, who had often served as intermediaries between competing nationalisms, were now embracing their own nationalist agenda, how could the empire continue to function as a mediating force between Czech and German, Hungarian and Slovak, Croatian and Serbian aspirations? Herzl's critique of Habsburg multiculturalism was also intellectually sophisticated in ways that made it particularly difficult for imperial authorities to refute. As a trained lawyer and experienced journalist, he understood the legal and constitutional framework within which the empire operated, and he used this knowledge to expose the contradictions inherent in Habsburg policy. How could the empire grant autonomy to Hungarians while denying it to Czechs? How could it recognize Croatian distinctiveness while ignoring Polish national rights? How could it accommodate Catholic and Protestant differences while restricting Jewish religious and cultural expression? These questions had no satisfactory answers within the imperial framework, precisely because the Habsburg system was based on pragmatic compromise rather than consistent principle. Each ethnic arrangement had been negotiated separately, often under pressure from particular political circumstances, creating a patchwork of privileges and restrictions that seemed increasingly arbitrary as nationalist consciousness spread throughout the empire. Herzl's intellectual influence extended far beyond the relatively small number of Jews who actually embraced Zionism during his lifetime. His analysis of ethnic relations, his critique of assimilationist strategies, and his vision of nationalist self-determination resonated with intellectuals from other minority communities who were grappling with similar questions about their place within the Habsburg system. Czech, Polish, and South Slavic nationalist leaders studied Herzl's writings not because they were interested in Zionism per se, but because his arguments about the inadequacy of minority accommodation within multinational empires applied to their own situations. If Herzl was correct that true security and dignity required sovereign statehood, then their own movements for autonomy or federalism within the Habsburg framework were merely way stations on the road to complete independence. The organizational methods that Herzl developed for the Zionist movement also provided a model for other nationalist groups within the empire. His combination of international networking, fundraising, publicity campaigns, and diplomatic pressure demonstrated how a relatively small minority could achieve disproportionate political influence through strategic organization and ideological clarity. The World Zionist Organization that Herzl founded in 1897 was, in many ways, a state-in-waiting that paralleled and competed with Habsburg institutions. It had its own Congress, its own financial mechanisms, its own diplomatic representatives, and its own long-term planning processes. This institutional development showed other nationalist movements how they might organize themselves to achieve similar goals, providing a template for building parallel structures that could eventually replace imperial administration. Herzl's early death in 1904 meant that he did not live to see the collapse of the Habsburg Empire or the establishment of the Jewish state he had envisioned. But his intellectual legacy continued to work like a slow-acting poison in the imperial system, undermining the philosophical foundations of Habsburg legitimacy and providing other nationalist movements with both arguments and organizational methods they would use to achieve their own independence. The tragedy of Herzl's relationship with the Habsburg Empire was that his critique was both accurate and destructive. He was correct in recognizing that the empire's ethnic arrangements were ultimately unstable and that minority communities could not rely indefinitely on imperial tolerance for their security. But his solution, the creation of ethnically homogeneous nation-states, would prove even more destructive than the problems it was meant to solve. The Europe that emerged from the Habsburg collapse would be far more ethnically segregated and politically unstable than the empire Herzl had criticized. The nation-states that replaced Austrian rule would engage in ethnic cleansing, population transfers, and genocidal policies that made Habsburg ethnic tensions seem mild by comparison. The very tolerance and diversity that Herzl had found inadequate would come to seem precious in retrospect, as Europe learned through bitter experience the true costs of ethnic nationalism. But these future tragedies were invisible to Herzl and his contemporaries, who genuinely believed they were working toward a more just and rational organization of human society. From their perspective, the Habsburg Empire represented an outdated form of political organization that denied fundamental human rights to its subject peoples. They could not foresee that their alternative, a Europe organized along strictly ethnic lines, would prove even more oppressive and violent than the system they sought to replace. George von Hoesslin, the Hungarian nationalist who shattered the compromise. In the magnificent parliament building of Budapest, where the Danube's waters reflected the golden dome that symbolized Hungarian pride and ambition, there emerged a figure whose political maneuvering would prove as destructive to Habsburg unity as any military defeat or diplomatic disaster. George von Hoesslin was not a household name like Franz Joseph or a world-famous ideologist like Woodrow Wilson, but his influence on the internal dynamics of the Austro-Hungarian Empire would prove catastrophic in ways that only became apparent after the damage was irreversible. Born into the minor Hungarian nobility in 1852, Hoesslin represented a new generation of Magyar politicians who had grown up under the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, that delicate constitutional arrangement that had transformed the Austrian Empire into the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Unlike the previous generation of Hungarian revolutionaries who had fought openly against Austrian rule in 1848–49, Hoesslin and his contemporaries worked within the system, using the very freedoms that the compromise had granted to undermine the imperial structure from within. The Compromise of 1867 had been designed as a solution to the Hungarian problem that had plagued the Habsburg Empire for decades. By granting Hungary virtual independence in internal affairs while maintaining Habsburg control over foreign policy, defense, and certain financial matters, the arrangement was supposed to satisfy Hungarian national aspirations while preserving imperial unity. For a time, it seemed to work brilliantly, ushering in a period of economic growth, cultural flowering, and political stability that made Austria-Hungary appear stronger than ever. But the compromise contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, and George von Hoesslin proved to be a master gardener in cultivating those seeds until they grew into the thorny problems that would eventually strangle the empire. His political career was built on the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the dual monarchy. If Hungarians deserved autonomy because they constituted a distinct nation, then why shouldn't the same principle apply to the Czechs, Poles, Croats, and other ethnic groups within the empire? Hoeslin's early political career seemed conventional enough. Elected to the Hungarian parliament in 1878, he initially focused on economic issues and administrative reform, appearing to be a typical representative of the Hungarian gentry class that had dominated Magyar politics since the compromise. But beneath this conventional exterior lay a much more radical vision, one that would transform him from a provincial politician into one of the most dangerous enemies the Habsburg Empire ever faced. The key to understanding Hoeslin's destructive influence lies in recognizing that he was not primarily motivated by Hungarian nationalism in the traditional sense. Unlike earlier Hungarian revolutionaries like Lajos Kossuth, who had sought complete independence from Austrian rule, Hoesslin understood that Hungary's privileged position within the dual monarchy actually gave Magyars tremendous leverage over imperial policy. The real threat to Hungarian interests came not from Vienna but from the other ethnic groups within Hungary itself, who were beginning to demand the same rights and recognition that Hungarians had won from the Austrians. This insight led Hoesslin to develop what historians would later call the Hungarian strategy, a systematic campaign to use Magyar autonomy within the dual monarchy to suppress the national aspirations of non-Hungarian minorities within the Kingdom of Hungary. By the 1880s, under the influence of politicians like Hoesslin, the Hungarian government had embarked on an aggressive program of Magyarization designed to transform Slovaks, Romanians, Croats, and other minorities into loyal Hungarian citizens. The Magyarization policies that Hoesslin championed were remarkable for their thoroughness and their counterproductive effects. Hungarian became the mandatory language of instruction in all schools, regardless of the ethnic composition of local communities. Non-Hungarian cultural organizations were harassed or banned outright. Local government positions were reserved for Magyar speakers, effectively excluding minorities from political participation in their own regions. These policies might have succeeded in creating a unified Hungarian nation if they had been implemented gradually and with some sensitivity to minority concerns. But Hoesslin and his allies were in a hurry, driven by the fear that delay would allow minority nationalisms to become too strong to suppress. Their aggressive approach had exactly the opposite effect from what they intended, transforming previously loyal minorities into bitter enemies of the Hungarian state and, by extension, the Habsburg Empire itself. The tragedy of Hoeslin's policies was that they violated the very principle that had made the Austro-Hungarian Compromise possible in the first place. The compromise had been based on the recognition that forcing unwilling peoples to abandon their national identity was both morally wrong and politically disastrous. Yet once Hungarians had secured their own national rights, many Magyar politicians like Hoesslin seemed determined to deny those same rights to others. This contradiction did not go unnoticed by the other ethnic groups within the empire. Czech politicians pointed out that if Hungarians deserved autonomy because they spoke a different language and had a distinct culture, then Czechs, who also spoke a different language and had an equally distinct culture, deserved the same consideration. Slovak intellectuals noted that they were being oppressed by the very people who had recently been oppressed themselves by the Austrians. Hoeslin's response to these criticisms revealed the fundamental weakness of his position. He argued that Hungary was a political nation rather than an ethnic nation, meaning that anyone who lived within Hungarian borders and accepted Hungarian culture could become a true Hungarian regardless of their ethnic background. This argument might have been convincing if the Magyarization policies had actually been voluntary and if genuine opportunities for advancement had been available to minorities who embraced Hungarian identity. But the reality was quite different. The Hungarian government's definition of acceptable assimilation was so narrow and demanding that it amounted to cultural suicide for minorities. Non-Hungarians were expected not merely to learn the Magyar language but to abandon their own languages entirely, not merely to respect Hungarian culture but to pretend that their own cultures had never existed. The most devastating aspect of Hoeslin's strategy was its impact on the South Slavic populations of Hungary, particularly the Croats and Serbs who lived in the southern regions of the kingdom. These groups had traditionally been among the most loyal supporters of the Habsburg Dynasty, viewing Austrian rule as protection against Ottoman expansion and later as a guarantee of their cultural and religious autonomy. But the aggressive majorization policies championed by Hoslin transformed these loyal subjects into potential revolutionaries. Croatian intellectuals who had once looked to Vienna as a protector against Hungarian domination now began to look south toward Serbia, where an independent Slavic state offered an alternative model of political organization. Serbian communities within Hungary began to maintain clandestine contacts with Belgrade, creating the networks that would later be used to support anti-Austrian activities. The irony was that Hoslin's policies were creating exactly the security threats that they were supposedly designed to prevent. By attempting to forcibly assimilate the South Slavic minorities, Hungarian authorities were driving them into the arms of external enemies who promised to protect their cultural and national rights. The very groups that had once served as a buffer between the Habsburg Empire and hostile neighbors were being transformed into potential fifth columns. Hoslin's influence extended far beyond Hungary itself, because his success in manipulating the dual monarchy system encouraged similar strategies among other ethnic groups within the empire. If Hungarians could use their autonomy to oppress minorities within their sphere of control, then why shouldn't Germans in Austria pursue similar policies toward their Slavic minorities? If the principle of national self-determination could be selectively applied to benefit some groups while disadvantaging others, then what moral authority did the empire have to resist more radical nationalist demands? The political movement that Hoslin represented also had profound implications for the empire's foreign policy. By alienating the South Slavic minorities who had traditionally been loyal to the Habsburg dynasty, Hungarian majorization policies made Austria-Hungary appear increasingly vulnerable to Serbian expansion. The Serbian kingdom, despite its small size and limited resources, could now present itself as the liberator of oppressed Slavs rather than as an aggressive neighbor seeking territorial aggrandizement. This shift in perception had enormous consequences for the diplomatic balance of power in southeastern Europe. Russia, which had previously viewed Austria-Hungary as a relatively benign neighbor with legitimate interests in the Balkans, now saw the dual monarchy as an oppressive state that was systematically mistreating its Slavic minorities. Pan-Slavic sentiment, which had been declining during the relatively tolerant early years of the dual monarchy, experienced a dramatic revival as news of Hungarian oppression spread throughout the Slavic world. Hoslin's personal career trajectory illustrated the broader pattern of radicalization that his policies had helped to create. What had begun as a relatively moderate program of administrative centralization gradually evolved into an increasingly extreme form of ethnic nationalism that brooked no compromise with minority demands. By the 1890s, Hoslin was advocating policies that would have been considered scandalously radical when he first entered politics in the 1870s. The politician who had once spoken in favor of gradual assimilation and voluntary cultural adaptation now called for the complete elimination of minority languages from public life. The man who had initially justified majorization as a modernizing force that would help backward minorities enter the modern world now spoke of Hungarians as a master race destined to rule over inferior peoples. This radicalization was partly a response to the failure of earlier, more moderate policies. As minority resistance to majorization grew stronger, Hungarian politicians like Hoslin concluded that they needed to apply even more pressure rather than reconsidering their basic approach. Each act of minority defiance was met with harsher countermeasures, creating a spiral of conflict that made compromise increasingly impossible. The electoral dynamics of Hungarian politics also contributed to this radicalization. Politicians who advocated moderation toward minorities found themselves outflanked by more extreme competitors who promised to defend Hungarian interests more aggressively. Hoslin's own political survival depended on his ability to appear more patriotic, more uncompromising, and more willing to use state power against minority challenges than his rivals. By the time of the 1896 Millennium celebrations commemorating the Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin, Hoslin had become one of the leading advocates of what amounted to internal imperialism within the Habsburg Empire. The festivities that year were explicitly designed to celebrate Hungarian dominance over the kingdom's minorities, with elaborate pageants depicting Magyars as civilizers bringing progress to backward peoples. These celebrations revealed the extent to which Hungarian politics had been poisoned by the ethnic nationalism that Hoslin and his allies had promoted. What had once been a relatively tolerant society that accommodated multiple languages and cultures had been transformed into an aggressive ethno-state that viewed diversity as a threat to be eliminated rather than a resource to be cultivated. The ultimate tragedy of Hoeslin's career was that his policies weakened the very empire that had made Hungarian autonomy possible in the first place. By alienating minorities who might have been loyal Habsburg subjects, by encouraging similar nationalist extremism among other ethnic groups, and by undermining the principle of tolerance that had held the multinational empire together, Hungarian politicians like Hoeslin were sawing off the branch on which they sat. When the Habsburg Empire finally collapsed in 1918, the independent Hungarian state that emerged found itself surrounded by hostile neighbors who had been created partly in response to decades of Magyar oppression. The minorities that Hungarian nationalism had sought to suppress became the founding populations of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Greater Romania states that were explicitly organized to protect their peoples against any future Hungarian domination. George von Hoeslin died in 1913, just before the outbreak of World War I, but his political legacy lived on in the ethnic conflicts that would consume Central Europe for the remainder of the 20th century. The man who had sought to strengthen Hungarian dominance within the Habsburg Empire had instead helped to create the conditions that would make Hungarian independence both inevitable and tragic. Karl Lattenberger, the well-intentioned reformer who accelerated the collapse. In the labyrinthine corridors of the Hofburg Palace, where centuries of Habsburg tradition weighed upon every decision like dust upon ancient tapestries, there worked a man whose very competence would prove to be one of the final nails in the empire's coffin. Karl Lattenberger was the epitome of the Habsburg civil servant, intelligent, dedicated, multilingual, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to navigate the complex ethnic and constitutional arrangements that held the dual monarchy together. Yet it was precisely these qualities that made him so dangerous to the empire he served so faithfully. Born in 1847 into a German-speaking family from Lower Austria, Lattenberger represented the best of the Habsburg administrative tradition. His father had served as a district commissioner in Galicia. His grandfather had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, and his entire family tree was intertwined with the imperial bureaucracy that had governed Central Europe for generations. Young Karl grew up speaking German, Czech, and Polish with equal fluency, absorbing the cosmopolitan culture of the Habsburg lands as naturally as breathing. Lattenberger's educational background epitomized the empire's intellectual achievements. He studied law at the University of Vienna, philosophy at Charles University in Prague, and political economy at the University of Budapest, accumulating not just academic credentials but a deep understanding of the diverse peoples and problems that comprised the Habsburg domains. His doctoral dissertation, written in 1871, examined the legal foundations of federal systems and concluded that successful multinational states required constant adaptation to changing ethnic and economic circumstances. This early academic work foreshadowed the approach that would define Lattenberger's entire career in imperial service. Unlike traditional Habsburg conservatives who believed that the empire's problems could be solved through administrative efficiency and dynastic loyalty, Lattenberger understood that the dual monarchy faced fundamental structural challenges that required systematic reform rather than mere fine-tuning. When Lattenberger entered the imperial civil service in 1872, Austria-Hungary appeared to be thriving. The economy was growing rapidly, infrastructure projects were connecting previously isolated regions, and the constitutional settlement of 1867 seemed to have resolved the most serious ethnic tensions within the empire. But Lattenberger's keen analytical mind detected underlying problems that less perceptive observers missed. His first major assignment took him to Bohemia, where he served as an assistant to the provincial governor during the early 1870s. This experience gave him intimate knowledge of the Czech national movement and the growing tensions between Czech and German communities in the historic kingdom. Unlike many German-speaking officials who dismissed Czech nationalism as a passing phase or a manufactured grievance, Lattenberger recognized that Czech demands for equal treatment represented a fundamental challenge to the empire's German-dominated administrative structure. Lattenberger's reports from Bohemia revealed both his analytical brilliance and his tragic misunderstanding of the forces he was trying to manage. He correctly identified the sources of Czech discontent: economic discrimination, linguistic disadvantages in government service, and cultural condescension from German-speaking officials. His proposed solutions were equally perceptive: greater use of Czech in official business, more Czech appointments to government positions, and increased investment in Czech educational institutions. But Lattenberger failed to grasp that Czech nationalism had moved beyond demands for equal treatment within the existing system toward calls for fundamental constitutional change. The Czech politicians he met with and negotiated with were no longer satisfied with reforms that would give them a larger share of power within the Habsburg framework. They increasingly wanted their own autonomous institutions that would allow them to govern themselves according to their own values and priorities. This misunderstanding would prove typical of Lattenberger's entire approach to ethnic relations within the empire. As a rational, well-intentioned German liberal, he assumed that all ethnic groups fundamentally wanted the same thing: fair treatment, economic opportunity, and cultural respect within a unified imperial system. He could not comprehend that many minority leaders had concluded that such goals were impossible to achieve within the Habsburg framework, and that only independent nation-states could provide the security and dignity they sought. Lattenberger's promotion to the Ministry of the Interior in 1878 gave him empire-wide responsibilities and the opportunity to apply his reformist ideas on a larger canvas. His new position made him one of the most influential officials in the imperial government, responsible for managing relations between Vienna and the empire's diverse provincial administrations. It was a job that required extraordinary diplomatic skills, deep knowledge of local conditions, and the ability to balance competing demands from multiple ethnic groups simultaneously. The reform program that Lattenberger developed during his tenure at the Interior Ministry was remarkable for its comprehensiveness and its sensitivity to minority concerns. He proposed expanding the use of local languages in regional administration, creating more opportunities for minority advancement in the imperial bureaucracy, and establishing new institutions that would give ethnic communities greater control over their cultural and educational affairs. These proposals represented exactly the kind of evolutionary reform that might have preserved the Habsburg Empire if they had been implemented 30 years earlier. Lattenberger's vision of a truly federal Austria-Hungary, in which each ethnic group enjoyed genuine autonomy within an imperial framework, offered a potential alternative to both the rigid centralization favored by German conservatives and the complete independence demanded by radical nationalists. But by the 1880s, when Lattenberger's reform program was taking shape, the political dynamics within the empire had already shifted beyond the possibility of such moderate solutions. The success of German unification had inspired similar movements among other ethnic groups. The example of Hungarian autonomy had raised expectations throughout the empire, and the rise of mass politics had empowered radical leaders who rejected any form of compromise with imperial authority. The tragedy of Lattenberger's position was that his very competence and good intentions made him particularly dangerous to imperial stability. When ethnic leaders met with traditional Habsburg conservatives, they understood that they were dealing with officials who had no intention of making meaningful concessions. Such encounters might be frustrating, but they clarified the political situation and helped nationalist movements mobilize their supporters around clear grievances. But when ethnic leaders met with Lattenberger, they encountered a sympathetic official who seemed to understand their concerns and who promised significant reforms that would address their most legitimate complaints. This created false hopes that moderate solutions were possible and encouraged ethnic leaders to invest time and energy in negotiations that were ultimately doomed to failure. The problem was not that Lattenberger was insincere in his reform proposals, but that he lacked the political power to implement them effectively. The Habsburg system gave enormous influence to conservative forces, the military, the aristocracy, the Catholic Church, and the German-speaking bureaucracy that had vested interests in maintaining the status quo. These groups were willing to tolerate Lattenberger's reform discussions as long as they remained purely theoretical, but they mobilized effective opposition whenever concrete changes were proposed. This dynamic was particularly evident in Lattenberger's dealings with Czech political leaders during the 1880s and 1890s. He spent years negotiating with Czech representatives, developing elaborate proposals for administrative autonomy, linguistic equality, and cultural recognition that would have satisfied most Czech demands while preserving imperial unity. But whenever these negotiations approached successful conclusion, conservative forces within the imperial government found ways to sabotage or indefinitely postpone implementation. The Czech politicians who worked with Lattenberger gradually realized that he was not actually empowered to deliver on his promises, that the imperial system was fundamentally incapable of the kind of systematic reform that would be necessary to address minority grievances. This realization was devastating because it discredited not just Lattenberger personally but the entire possibility of achieving ethnic equality through evolutionary change within the Habsburg framework. Similar patterns developed in Lattenberger's dealings with Polish, Slovene, Croatian, and other minority leaders throughout the empire. In each case, his genuine sympathy and apparent willingness to negotiate meaningful reforms created expectations that the imperial system was ultimately unable to fulfill. The resulting disappointment and disillusionment pushed ethnic leaders toward more radical positions and convinced them that only complete independence could provide the recognition and autonomy they sought. Lattenberger's reform efforts also had unintended consequences for the empire's dominant ethnic groups. German-speaking Austrians and Hungarians watched nervously as minority demands escalated and reform proposals proliferated, fearing that any concessions to ethnic nationalism would eventually threaten their own privileged positions within the imperial system. The very possibility of systematic reform created anxiety among conservative elements that helped to radicalize Habsburg politics in increasingly destructive directions. The personal toll of these failed reform efforts gradually transformed Lattenberger from an optimistic young idealist into a bitter and disillusioned bureaucrat. His private correspondence from the 1890s reveals a man who had come to understand that the empire he served was fundamentally unreformable, that the structural problems he had identified could not be solved within the existing constitutional framework, but that any attempt to change that framework would likely destroy the empire entirely. This insight put Lattenberger in an impossible position. As a loyal Habsburg servant, he could not advocate for the kind of radical constitutional changes that might actually solve the empire's ethnic problems. But as an intelligent observer of political trends, he could see that the moderate reforms he was empowered to propose were inadequate to address the growing crisis of imperial legitimacy. Lattenberger's final major initiative, developed during the early 1900s, represented a last desperate attempt to save the Habsburg Empire through systematic reform. His proposal called for transforming Austria-Hungary into a truly federal state, with each major ethnic group receiving its own autonomous region within an imperial framework. This plan would have given Czechs, Poles, South Slavs, and other minorities the kind of self-governance they demanded while preserving imperial unity in foreign policy, defense, and economic matters. The federal proposal was remarkable for its sophistication and its sensitivity to ethnic concerns, but it was also utterly unrealistic given the political realities of early 20th century Austria-Hungary. German conservatives viewed it as a betrayal of Habsburg traditions. Hungarian leaders saw it as a threat to their privileged position within the dual monarchy, and minority nationalists dismissed it as too little, too late. The failure of Lattenberger's federal proposal marked the end of serious attempts to preserve the Habsburg Empire through evolutionary reform. By 1905, it had become clear that the empire's ethnic problems could not be solved through administrative adjustment or constitutional tinkering, that the forces of nationalism had advanced beyond the possibility of imperial accommodation. Lattenberger retired from government service in 1908, a broken man who had devoted his entire career to trying to save an empire that was already beyond salvation. His final years were spent writing memoirs that would not be published until after World War I, in which he analyzed the structural flaws that had made Habsburg collapse inevitable despite the best efforts of well-intentioned reformers like himself. The tragedy of Karl Lattenberger's career was that his intelligence, dedication, and good intentions actually accelerated the collapse of the empire he was trying to save. By raising expectations that could not be fulfilled, by negotiating reforms that could not be implemented, and by demonstrating the impossibility of meaningful change within the existing system, he helped convince ethnic leaders that revolution rather than reform was their only viable option. In the end, Lattenberger's story illustrates one of the most bitter ironies of Habsburg history, that the empire's greatest servants often proved to be its most effective destroyers, not through malice or incompetence, but through the very virtues that made them worthy of their positions in the first place. Franz Ferdinand, the heir who died for tomorrow. On a sun-drenched morning in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914, the future of the Habsburg Empire rode through the narrow cobblestone streets in an open car, waving to crowds that lined the route with a mixture of curiosity, enthusiasm, and barely concealed hostility. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had come to Bosnia to observe military maneuvers and to show the Habsburg flag in this recently annexed province where Serbian nationalism simmered like water on the verge of boiling. Franz Ferdinand was not supposed to be the heir. Born in 1863, he was the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph, third in line to succeed his great-uncle on the imperial throne. But the suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf in 1889 and the renunciation of succession rights by Franz Ferdinand's father had thrust this reluctant archduke into a position he had never sought and for which his temperament seemed poorly suited. Unlike the methodical, duty-bound Franz Joseph, Franz Ferdinand was a man of passion and contradictions. He was an ardent Catholic who married for love against imperial wishes, a military officer who despised the pomp and ceremony of court life, and a Habsburg who harbored deep suspicions about the very system he was destined to inherit. His marriage to Countess Sophie Chotek, a Czech noblewoman considered beneath his station, had required him to renounce any succession rights for their children, creating a personal grievance against the rigid hierarchies that defined Habsburg society. But it was precisely these personal frustrations that gave Franz Ferdinand a unique perspective on the empire's problems. Unlike Franz Joseph, who had spent 7 decades trying to balance competing ethnic demands through administrative compromise, the Archduke understood that the dual monarchy's fundamental structure was the source of its difficulties rather than the solution to them. Franz Ferdinand's political vision was radical by Habsburg standards, perhaps even revolutionary. He proposed transforming Austria-Hungary from a dual monarchy dominated by Germans and Hungarians into a truly federal empire where all major ethnic groups would enjoy equal status. His concept of trialism, adding a third, South Slavic component to the German-Austrian and Hungarian parts of the empire, represented a complete rejection of the 1867 compromise that had defined imperial politics for nearly half a century. This vision put Franz Ferdinand at odds with virtually every established interest within the empire. German-speaking Austrians viewed his federal proposals as a betrayal of their historic dominance over imperial institutions. Hungarian politicians saw trialism as a direct threat to their privileged position within the dual monarchy. Even many Slavic leaders were suspicious of reforms that might co-opt their nationalist movements without granting genuine independence. The Archduke's relationship with Emperor Franz Joseph was complicated by these political differences. The old emperor, now in his 80s, had spent decades perfecting the delicate balancing act that kept the dual monarchy functioning. He viewed his nephew's reform proposals as dangerous experiments that threatened to upset arrangements that had maintained imperial stability for nearly 50 years. Yet Franz Joseph also recognized that some form of change was inevitable. The rise of mass politics, the spread of nationalist ideologies, and the example of democratic reforms in Western Europe all suggested that the Habsburg Empire could not indefinitely maintain its traditional authoritarian structure. Franz Ferdinand represented the possibility of evolutionary change that might preserve imperial unity while accommodating ethnic aspirations. The tragedy of Franz Ferdinand's position was that his reform program, however well-intentioned, came too late to address problems that had been festering for decades. By 1914, many ethnic leaders within the empire had moved beyond demands for autonomy within an imperial framework toward calls for complete independence. The South Slavic populations that Franz Ferdinand hoped to satisfy through trialism were increasingly looking toward Serbia and other independent Slavic states as models for their own future. This shift in South Slavic opinion was particularly evident in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the provinces that Austria-Hungary had administered since 1878 and formally annexed in 1908. The Archduke's visit to Sarajevo in June 1914 was intended to demonstrate Habsburg authority in these contested territories, and to show that the empire could provide effective governance for its Slavic subjects. But the very fact that such a demonstration was necessary revealed the weakness of the Habsburg position. In a truly stable imperial system, the heir to the throne would not need to make risky public appearances in volatile border provinces to shore up popular support. The elaborate security precautions surrounding Franz Ferdinand's visit, the carefully orchestrated public events, and the obvious nervousness of local officials all testified to the artificial nature of Habsburg control in Bosnia. Franz Ferdinand himself seemed aware of the dangers he faced during the Sarajevo visit. His correspondence in the weeks leading up to the trip reveals a man who understood that he was taking considerable personal risks for uncertain political gains. He had received multiple warnings about Serbian terrorist activities in Bosnia, and his own security advisors had recommended postponing or canceling the visit entirely. Yet the Archduke felt compelled to proceed with the trip, partly out of a sense of dynastic duty but also because he believed that personal diplomacy could succeed where administrative measures had failed. Franz Ferdinand genuinely thought that if he could meet with South Slavic leaders face to face, if he could explain his vision of federal reform and demonstrate his respect for Slavic culture, he might be able to win over moderate elements within the nationalist movement. This belief reflected both Franz Ferdinand's admirable confidence in the power of reasoned discussion and his tragic misunderstanding of the political forces arrayed against him. The Serbian nationalist groups that were plotting his assassination were not interested in negotiating reforms within the Habsburg system. They were committed to the complete destruction of Austrian influence in the Balkans and the creation of a greater Serbia that would unite all South Slavs under Belgrade's leadership. The assassination itself, carried out by Gavrilo Princip and his fellow conspirators from the Black Hand organization, was both a personal tragedy and a political catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. In the span of a few seconds, a single pistol shot eliminated not just the heir to the Habsburg throne but also the last realistic hope for evolutionary reform that might have preserved the empire through adaptation rather than revolution. The immediate impact of Franz Ferdinand's death was to remove from the imperial succession the one member of the Habsburg family who understood the need for fundamental change. His replacement as heir, his elderly great-uncle Franz Joseph, represented continuity with policies that had already proven inadequate to address the empire's mounting crises. The emperor's decision to respond to the assassination with military action against Serbia reflected his 19th-century mindset and his inability to comprehend that modern warfare would destroy the very empire he was trying to defend. But the longer-term consequences of Franz Ferdinand's assassination were even more devastating. His death eliminated the political figure who might have been able to implement the kind of federal reforms that could have satisfied moderate ethnic leaders while preserving imperial unity. Without the Archduke's vision of trialism and constitutional reform, the Habsburg Empire had no alternative to offer its restive minorities except continued subordination or complete independence. The war that followed Franz Ferdinand's assassination exposed every weakness in the imperial system that the Archduke had hoped to reform. The army proved to be divided by the same ethnic tensions that plagued civilian society, with Czech, Polish, and South Slavic units showing little enthusiasm for fighting against their ethnic cousins in enemy forces. The dual monarchy's constitutional structure, which had seemed manageable during peacetime, became a source of fatal division when unified action was required for military survival. Franz Ferdinand's death also had profound implications for the international balance of power. His known opposition to war with Serbia and his preference for negotiated solutions to ethnic conflicts might have provided a diplomatic alternative to the military escalation that ultimately engulfed all of Europe. The Archduke's assassination removed a voice for moderation at the crucial moment when such voices were most desperately needed. The irony of Franz Ferdinand's legacy is that his death accomplished exactly the opposite of what his life's work had been designed to achieve. Instead of creating a reformed Habsburg Empire that could accommodate South Slavic aspirations, his assassination led to the complete destruction of Austria-Hungary and the creation of independent nation-states that excluded German and Hungarian minorities who had previously enjoyed privileged positions within the imperial system. The Archduke who had died trying to preserve imperial unity through federal reform became, in death, the unwitting catalyst for imperial dissolution through total war. His vision of a multinational empire based on ethnic equality was replaced by a patchwork of nation-states based on ethnic exclusion, creating new problems that would plague Central Europe for the remainder of the 20th century. Franz Ferdinand's tragic fate thus embodies the broader tragedy of the Habsburg Empire itself. Good intentions undermined by historical forces beyond any individual's control, reasonable solutions made impossible by the accumulated weight of past mistakes, and evolutionary change prevented by revolutionary violence that destroyed everything it touched. Leopold II, the liberal emperor's conservative legacy. In the shadows of Habsburg history, overshadowed by more famous relatives and more dramatic events, stands a figure whose reign paradoxically illustrates both the potential for Habsburg adaptation and the ultimate impossibility of imperial reform. Leopold II, who ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1790 to 1792, lived and died too early to witness the ethnic conflicts that would eventually destroy the Austrian Empire, yet his reign established patterns of liberal reform and conservative reaction that would define Habsburg politics for the next century and a quarter. Born in 1747 as Peter Leopold, the third son of Empress Maria Theresa, He was never intended to inherit the imperial crown. His destiny lay instead in Italy, where he served as Grand Duke of Tuscany from 1765 until his unexpected elevation to the imperial throne following the death of his brother Joseph II. This Italian experience would prove crucial in shaping Leopold's approach to governance, giving him first-hand knowledge of both the possibilities and limitations of enlightened reform within traditional monarchical frameworks. Leopold's reign in Tuscany had established him as one of Europe's most progressive rulers. He abolished torture and the death penalty, granted religious tolerance to minorities, reformed the legal system along rational lines, and attempted to create representative institutions that would give his subjects a voice in their own governance. These reforms were remarkable not just for their humanitarian content, but for their systematic nature. Leopold was not merely responding to immediate crises, but implementing a coherent vision of how modern states should operate. Yet Leopold's Tuscan reforms also revealed the fundamental tensions that would later paralyze Habsburg attempts at imperial modernization. His progressive policies were imposed from above by enlightened autocratic authority, without genuine consultation with the people they were designed to benefit. The representative institutions he created were carefully designed to channel popular participation in directions that would not threaten monarchical prerogatives. Liberty was granted as a gift from the sovereign rather than claimed as a right by the citizens. When Leopold inherited the Austrian throne in 1790, he faced an empire in crisis. His predecessor, Joseph II, had attempted to implement sweeping reforms that had provoked rebellions in Hungary and the Austrian Netherlands, religious conflicts throughout the Catholic provinces, and administrative chaos as traditional institutions struggled to adapt to revolutionary changes imposed from Vienna. Leopold's response revealed both his political wisdom and his tragic limitations. He understood that Joseph II's reforms had failed not because they were wrong in principle, but because they had been implemented too rapidly and without sufficient attention to local conditions and traditional sensibilities. Leopold's approach was to preserve the essence of his brother's progressive vision while moderating its implementation to reduce social and political tensions. This strategy of gradual, consensual reform represented exactly the kind of evolutionary change that might have preserved the Habsburg Empire if it had been consistently applied over several generations. Leopold understood that successful modernization required balancing innovation with tradition, that effective reform needed to accommodate existing interests while gradually expanding opportunities for previously excluded groups. But Leopold's reign was cut short by his sudden death in March 1792, after less than 2 years on the imperial throne. His death eliminated the Habsburg Dynasty's most skilled practitioner of gradual reform at precisely the moment when such skills were most desperately needed. The French Revolution was spreading radical ideas throughout Europe. Nationalism was beginning to stir among the empire's ethnic minorities, and traditional forms of monarchical authority were coming under unprecedented pressure. Leopold's successor, his son Francis II, later Francis I of Austria, lacked both his father's liberal instincts and his sophisticated understanding of how to manage social change. Francis's response to the revolutionary challenges of his era was to retreat into rigid conservatism, abandoning Leopold's careful balance between reform and tradition in favor of repression and reaction. This conservative turn had profound consequences for the empire's later development. Instead of building on Leopold's example of gradual, consensual modernization, Habsburg policy for the next generation focused on preserving existing institutions against any form of change. The result was to store up social and political pressures that would eventually explode with devastating force during the revolutions of 1848. Leopold's brief reign thus represents a crucial missed opportunity in Habsburg history. His vision of enlightened monarchy adapting gradually to changing social conditions offered a potential alternative to both revolutionary upheaval and reactionary stagnation. If his approach had been continued by his successors, the Austrian Empire might have evolved into a constitutional monarchy that could have accommodated ethnic diversity within a federal framework. The tragedy of Leopold's legacy was that his death came just as the techniques he had developed for managing social change were becoming most relevant to imperial survival. The ethnic nationalisms that would eventually destroy Austria-Hungary were still in their infancy during Leopold's reign, but his methods of gradual reform, consensual change, and respect for local traditions offered tools that might have channeled nationalist energies in constructive rather than destructive directions. Leopold's Italian experience had also given him insights into the management of ethnic diversity that would have been invaluable in dealing with the empire's later multinational challenges. Tuscany was linguistically and culturally distinct from Austria, yet Leopold had successfully maintained imperial authority while respecting local traditions and gradually expanding popular participation in governance. The federal implications of Leopold's approach were never fully developed because of his early death, but his reign suggested that the Habsburg Empire might have evolved into a genuinely federal system where different regions enjoyed considerable autonomy while remaining united under imperial leadership. This vision of voluntary unity based on mutual benefit rather than coercive subordination offered an alternative to both the rigid centralization that characterized most of Habsburg history and the complete dissolution that eventually befell the empire. Leopold's death thus eliminated not just a reforming emperor but an entire tradition of Habsburg liberalism that might have provided the empire with the intellectual and political resources necessary to survive the challenges of the 19th and 20th centuries. His brief reign stands as a reminder of roads not taken, possibilities foreclosed by historical accident rather than inherent impossibility. Mihai I and Peter II, the heirs of a shattered world. As the Habsburg Empire breathed its last in the autumn of 1918, collapsing under the weight of military defeat, ethnic rebellion, and imperial exhaustion, new figures emerged from the wreckage to claim pieces of the ancient dynasty's former domains. Among these inheritors of the post-Habsburg order were two young monarchs whose reigns would be defined by their relationship to the empire's collapse: King Mihai I of Romania and King Peter II of Yugoslavia. These monarchs represented the triumph of the nationalist principle over imperial unity, yet their stories also revealed the tragic consequences of that triumph. Both inherited thrones that existed only because the Habsburg Empire had died, both ruled over territories that had been carved from the empire's corpse, and both would eventually lose their crowns to the very forces of radical nationalism that had made their reigns possible in the first place. King Mihai I of Romania embodied the complex legacy of Habsburg collapse more completely than perhaps any other figure of his generation. Born in 1921, he was the great-great-grandson of Empress Maria Theresa through multiple lines of descent, making him a direct inheritor of Habsburg blood even as he ruled over a kingdom that had been built partly through anti-Austrian warfare and diplomacy. Romania's relationship with the Habsburg Empire had always been complicated. The principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia had maintained their independence from Austrian control, but Transylvania, with its large Romanian population, had remained under Habsburg rule until 1918. The dream of uniting all Romanians under a single crown had driven Bucharest's foreign policy for decades, making Romania both an enemy and a rival of the dual monarchy. When Mihai inherited his throne, first as a child in 1927 and then again as a young man in 1940, he ruled over a greater Romania that included not just the old principalities but also Transylvania, Bukovina, and Bessarabia territories that had been taken from the Habsburg and Russian empires during the post-war reorganization of Eastern Europe. His kingdom represented the fulfillment of Romanian nationalist dreams, yet it also embodied the problems that would plague all the successor states that emerged from imperial collapse. The Romania that Mihai inherited was ethnically diverse, including not just Romanians but also Hungarians, Germans, Jews, and other minorities who had previously enjoyed protected status within the Habsburg framework. The new kingdom's attempts to impose Romanian cultural and political dominance over these minorities replicated on a smaller scale the same ethnic conflicts that had eventually destroyed Austria-Hungary. Mihai's reign was thus haunted by the ghost of the empire his kingdom had helped to destroy. The tolerance and diversity that had characterized Habsburg rule, however imperfectly, were replaced by an aggressive nationalism that sought to eliminate minority differences rather than accommodate them. The very success of Romanian nationalism in achieving its territorial goals created new problems that the new kingdom proved incapable of solving. King Peter II of Yugoslavia represented an even more direct challenge to the Habsburg legacy. Born in 1923, he inherited a throne that existed only because the South Slavic populations of Austria-Hungary had rejected imperial rule in favor of national independence. Yugoslavia was explicitly conceived as an anti-Habsburg state, designed to unite under Serbian leadership the South Slavic peoples who had previously been divided between Austrian and Hungarian administration. Yet Peter's kingdom faced even more severe problems than Romania in managing the ethnic diversity it had inherited from the Habsburg collapse. Yugoslavia included not just Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes but also Bosnian Muslims, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and various minority populations whose relationships with each other had been complicated by centuries of religious, cultural, and political differences. The Yugoslav attempt to forge a unified South Slavic identity proved even more artificial and unstable than the Habsburg attempt to maintain imperial unity through administrative compromise. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was dominated by Serbian institutions and Serbian cultural assumptions, creating resentments among Croats and other non-Serbian populations that paralleled the ethnic tensions that had characterized the final decades of Austrian rule. Peter's reign, which lasted from 1934 to 1945, was defined by the kingdom's inability to resolve these internal contradictions. The centralized Serbian monarchy that emerged after 1918 was no more successful at managing ethnic diversity than the decentralized Habsburg system it had replaced. Indeed, Yugoslav ethnic conflicts proved to be even more violent and destructive than the relatively restrained tensions that had characterized the final decades of Austrian rule. Both Mihai and Peter ultimately lost their thrones to communist revolutions that promised to solve the ethnic and social problems that had plagued their kingdoms since independence. The nationalism that had destroyed the Habsburg Empire proved incapable of creating stable alternatives to imperial rule, opening the way for radical ideologies that promised more comprehensive solutions to the region's endemic problems. The tragic irony of these monarchs' reigns was that they represented the fulfillment of nationalist dreams that had animated anti-Habsburg movements for decades. Yet their kingdoms proved to be less successful at managing ethnic diversity and maintaining political stability than the empire they had replaced. The Romania and Yugoslavia that emerged from Habsburg collapse were more ethnically homogeneous than Austria-Hungary had been, yet they were also more oppressive toward their minorities and less capable of peaceful conflict resolution. The failure of these successor states vindicated, in retrospect, some of the Habsburg claims about the benefits of imperial unity and the dangers of ethnic nationalism. The empire's multinational character, which had seemed like a weakness during the age of nationalism, began to appear more like a strength as Europe learned through bitter experience the costs of organizing political life around ethnic exclusion rather than ethnic accommodation. Conclusion: the end of an age. As the last Habsburg emperor signed his abdication in the fading light of November 1918, more than a dynasty ended. An entire conception of human organization, 6 centuries in the making, breathed its final breath. The double-headed eagle that had soared over the battlefields of Europe, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Adriatic, from the spires of Prague to the plains of Hungary, folded its wings forever. In its place arose the harsh geometry of nation-states, each claiming the exclusive loyalty of its ethnic citizens, each promising a future free from the messy compromises that had characterized imperial rule. The 10 figures whose stories we have traced through these pages were not merely individuals making personal choices in extraordinary times. They were representatives of larger historical forces: nationalism and liberalism, idealism and pragmatism, tradition and revolution, that had been building pressure against the foundations of the old European order for more than a century. Their decisions, their failures, and their successes illuminated the broader tragedy of an empire that proved incapable of adapting to a world it no longer understood. Franz Joseph I, the eternal emperor who had seemed as permanent as the Alps themselves, embodied both the strengths and the fatal weaknesses of the Habsburg system. His devotion to duty, his administrative competence, and his genuine care for his subjects' welfare represented the best traditions of dynastic rule. Yet his inability to comprehend the forces of nationalism and modernization that were reshaping European consciousness made him the unwitting architect of his empire's destruction. The war he authorized in 1914 was fought with the assumptions of 1848, and the result was catastrophe on a scale that his traditional worldview could neither anticipate nor prevent. His successor, the tragic Karl I, represented the road not taken, the possibility of evolutionary reform that might have preserved imperial unity while accommodating ethnic aspirations. Karl's vision of federal restructuring, democratic participation, and national autonomy within an imperial framework offered exactly the kind of compromise that might have saved Austria-Hungary if it had been implemented 30 years earlier. But by 1918, the forces Karl was trying to harness had moved beyond the possibility of imperial accommodation toward demands for complete independence that no Habsburg concession could satisfy. Across the Atlantic, Woodrow Wilson wielded a pen that proved mightier than any Habsburg sword. His principle of national self-determination provided the intellectual framework that transformed ethnic rebellion from treason into patriotism, that turned imperial subjects into oppressed nationalities deserving of international support. Wilson's idealism was genuine and his concern for human rights sincere, yet his vision of a world organized along strictly ethnic lines would prove far more violent and unstable than the multinational empire he helped to destroy. Theodor Herzl, the visionary who had emerged from the cosmopolitan culture of Habsburg Vienna, demonstrated how the empire's very success in integrating minorities could become a source of its destruction. Herzl's journey from assimilated Habsburg subject to Zionist revolutionary illustrated the broader pattern by which the empire's most talented minority citizens concluded that their long-term security required separate nationhood rather than continued imperial citizenship. His critique of multinational accommodation provided intellectual ammunition for other nationalist movements that would eventually dismember the empire that had nurtured them. The internal dynamics of imperial collapse were represented by figures like George von Hoesslin and Karl Lattenberger, whose opposing strategies, aggressive ethnic domination and well-intentioned reform, both contributed to the empire's ultimate dissolution. Hoeslin's Hungarian nationalism demonstrated how the empire's federal arrangements could be manipulated to oppress minorities rather than protect them, while Lattenberger's reform efforts showed how even the most intelligent and sympathetic attempts at evolutionary change could raise expectations that the imperial system was ultimately incapable of fulfilling. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand eliminated the last realistic hope for imperial adaptation, while the brief reign of Leopold II served as a reminder of the roads not taken, the possibilities for gradual modernization that were foreclosed by historical accident rather than inherent impossibility. The successor monarchs Mihai I and Peter II inherited kingdoms built from Habsburg ruins, yet their reigns demonstrated that nationalism was no more successful than imperialism at managing ethnic diversity and maintaining political stability. The tragedy of the Habsburg Empire's collapse was not that it represented the inevitable triumph of progress over tradition, or of democracy over autocracy, or of national self-determination over imperial domination. The tragedy was that it destroyed a system of ethnic accommodation that, however imperfect, had maintained peace among diverse populations for centuries, replacing it with a patchwork of nation-states that would spend the next generation engaged in the ethnic cleansing, population transfers, and genocidal policies that made Habsburg ethnic tensions seem mild by comparison. The Europe that emerged from the empire's collapse was more ethnically homogeneous than the one that had preceded it, yet it was also more violent, more unstable, and more oppressive toward the minorities that remained within its borders. The First World War that destroyed Austria-Hungary was followed by a Second World War that completed the process of ethnic unmixing that the empire's collapse had begun. The Holocaust, the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe, the population exchanges between Greece and Turkey, and dozens of smaller ethnic cleansings eliminated the cultural diversity that had once flourished under imperial protection. The Cold War that followed merely froze these ethnic divisions in place, creating an artificial stability that collapsed as soon as communist control ended. The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, fought over territories that had once been peaceful provinces of Austria-Hungary, demonstrated that the ethnic hatreds supposedly resolved by national independence had merely been suppressed rather than eliminated. The Balkan conflicts that had helped to trigger the empire's collapse in 1914 resumed, with even greater ferocity, once the imperial and communist frameworks that had contained them were removed. Today, as we survey the ruins of the post-Habsburg order, the failed states, the ethnic conflicts, the refugee crises, and the rise of authoritarianism throughout Eastern Europe, the Habsburg Empire's vision of unity through diversity appears less like an anachronistic relic and more like a lost alternative to the nationalist nightmares that followed its destruction. The empire's tolerance for ethnic and religious differences, its promotion of cultural autonomy within political unity, and its emphasis on administrative competence over ideological purity offer lessons that remain relevant to our own struggles with diversity and integration. The 10 figures whose stories we have followed were neither heroes nor villains, but human beings caught in the currents of historical change that proved stronger than any individual will or wisdom. Their tragedy was not that they made wrong choices, but that they lived in a time when all choices led toward destruction, when the accumulated weight of past decisions had created problems that no amount of intelligence, goodwill, or political skill could solve. The Habsburg Empire died because the world had changed around it in ways that made its continued existence impossible, not because it was inherently inferior to the alternatives that replaced it. The lesson of its collapse is not that progress is inevitable or that nationalism is irresistible, but that political institutions, however successful, must constantly adapt to changing circumstances or face extinction. As we face our own challenges of ethnic integration, economic inequality, and political fragmentation, the Habsburg example reminds us that there are no permanent solutions to the fundamental problems of human organization, only temporary accommodations that must be constantly renewed and reimagined. The empire fell not because it was evil, but because it was human, and in its humanity, we can recognize both the possibilities and the limitations of our own political arrangements. The double-headed eagle has not flown for more than a century, yet its shadow still falls across the map of Europe, reminding us of what was lost when the old world died and challenging us to build something better from the ruins of what came after. In the end, the Habsburg Empire's greatest legacy may be not what it accomplished during its 6 centuries of existence, but what its absence revealed about the alternatives that replaced it. The age of empires is over, but the problems that empires tried to solve, how to manage diversity, how to balance competing interests, how to maintain unity without sacrificing liberty, remain as urgent today as they were in the elegant salons of Vienna or the smoky coffeehouses of Budapest where the empire's fate was debated and decided. The 10 figures who helped to end the Habsburg age were neither the last of the old world nor the first of the new, but bridges between two eras, carrying within themselves both the promise and the peril of the transformation they helped to create. Their stories remind us that history is made not by abstract forces but by individual human beings making choices under impossible circumstances, trying to preserve what they value while adapting to changes they cannot control. In their failures and successes, their wisdom and blindness, their courage and cowardice, we can recognize the eternal human struggle to build political orders that serve human needs while acknowledging human limitations. The Habsburg Empire is gone, but the questions it tried to answer echo still in every parliament and council chamber, every negotiation between majority and minority, every attempt to build unity from diversity. The 10 who ended an age left us not answers but questions, not solutions but challenges, not certainties but the hard-won wisdom that comes from watching a world die and another being born. In the end, perhaps that is legacy enough.